We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Hey everyone, before beginning this episode, I wanted to issue a little bit of a challenge and encourage everyone that listens to this episode to leave a comment, whether you agree, whether you disagree. You know, after the episode, David and I had a little bit of a discussion that very often we see when we end up reading the comments, we see a lot of people that disagree, but if you tend to agree, you might not actually leave a comment. So again, I would just encourage everybody to go leave a comment to tell us if you agree, to disagree, to leave constructive feedback, hopefully. But just let us know what you thought about the episode if you did listen to the whole thing. As always, I really appreciate everybody listening and hope you enjoy the episode. Here it is. Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is David Murrin, global forecaster and author of Breaking the Code of History, Lions Led by Lions, and Red Lightning. David, thanks for joining me today.
Tom, it's lovely to be on the show, ready to grapple with the old bots that attack us regularly afterwards.
Well, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the bots and the real people, but you know, when I get constructive criticism, I try to really take it into account. But you know, true quality constructive criticism seems to be few and far between these days. But you know, hopefully we can integrate that as part of our learning process.
I so agree with you. It's really great to have and democracy is about discourse, discussion, but you really want it to be on a level of, non-emotional, balanced, intellectual, where you can change each other's ideas rather than shout at each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, getting into a lot of the topics that we normally speak about on this show, but especially some of the topics that we're going to approach to understand today, require a level of humility, certainly from myself, and I think from the audience as well, to really try to understand, to try to be able to try and account for all of the chips that are on the table, which is something that's quite difficult to do. I think we're all, we all kind of inherently have a little bit of a bias one way or the other. And I really have made it a practice, especially kind of doing the show, to be able to do my best to try to account for and to understand all of the different opinions and viewpoints that are brought forward to me.
Which is really, that's what democracy is about. Also makes you a great interviewer. I think also, should point out for your listeners, these aren't just sort of David Murrin fell out of bed on the right side of the bed or the left side and thought this. Mm-hmm. All of my views are a product of a study, of a systematic way that humanity self-organizes into social groups, whether they be tribes, nations, empires, how we interact. And so the things that I'm talking to you about are not just, personal views. They're views developed with a construct. And that construct allows those views to be analyzed compared to other historical prerogatives, and also to be a more impersonal process. So I would urge you, as you hear things which are challenging, to actually stop a minute and just, this isn't an opinion of someone who sits on somewhere else in the political spectrum, but actually a lengthy study that over 20 years has generated a power to predict human behavior that is really unimaginable, and therefore must have validity in a commentary on how we behaved, how we are behaving, and how we will behave.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that careful study over time, and hopefully that comes without bias, also is, an invaluable tool in analyzing and learning from the past, because we've repeated so many of these cycles. And, much of the discussions that you and I have had, David, are around these cycles. So maybe we can start getting into this idea of what we need to learn from these past cycles, and kind of framing that in the discussion of understanding how the West might be able to deter World War III with China and Russia, and maybe what that also means kind of in conjunction with this commodity peak?
That's about 5 questions already, Tom. Well, look, I think one of the places would be good to start is I'm always open, as you said you are, to criticism. So people argue that my predictions seem very deterministic and they don't take into account variables. And that's an interesting observation because I can understand why people would say that. And so why, when I believe in a quantum mechanical world of infinite probabilities, do I actually present such deterministic, predictable cycles that we keep repeating? And one of the things about the quantum mechanical world is consciousness interacts with the quantum mechanical world and changes it. But I would argue unconsciousness locks us into repeated patterns that our unconscious keeps manifesting. So actually, rather than being deterministic, the problem is we're unconscious. And therefore, we're unaware of how we act and how we behave. And therefore, we keep repeating those cycles and constantly surprised at outcomes because, as you say, people on the whole don't study how these cycles operate and how clearly, when you break them down, as it did in Breaking the Code of History, those cycles continue to keep cycling in front of us. And many of them are generational. So you have to study history objectively, and I would argue scientifically, which is not something humanities promote, to start to see how that cycle drops out. And I've done that work and I presented it to the world, and it's incredibly powerful. And the proof in the pudding is for 20 years, it's predicted exactly what would happen to the Western world, interrelating with China, superimposed with a commodity cycle that had all the other quantities and dynamics that go with that. So it's really worth considering. And there are lots of people out there who think they've cracked behavior, but I don't think there's any system I've come across that so accurately understood and portrayed what's been happening to us and indeed where we are and what will happen, which leads us into this profound question is we're in a pickle right now. We've sleepwalked into literally a blind alley. The blind alley has seen the onset 8 years out before the Kondratiev peak of 2030, the onset of the invasion of Ukraine, and now, a regional war since last year with Iran fighting Israel. Now, those pretty interesting in that at the peak of the Cold War, which the peak was 75, what we actually had was one small local war in Afghanistan. That was the only product of a kinetic peak of the K-wave cycle 54 years ago, even though the Cold War felt titanic and we risked a nuclear mushroom cloud destroying us all. But manifesting physically in kinetic activity was one war in Afghanistan that took the Russians 70,000 lives to lose. This is completely different magnitude. This is a battle in Ukraine the size of many Stalingrads. And if you go and look at the casualties and process, it is titanic. The Russian economy is looking to spend $189 billion on the war next year. So to give some idea, that means that we've got to give an equivalent, if not more, to Ukraine in terms of financial aid converted to military aid to ensure some kind of victory, which we'll come on to. We've sleepwalked into Ukraine. We've suffered from Biden's bloody stalemate, which is basically the worst form of appeasement. And that's one of the core things is we all look at Chamberlain and we think, you're an appeaser. Because why? Because you went to Czechoslovakia, you gave it away, and you said, Hitler, you can have it, and said peace in our time. But he was doing something at the time which we forget. He was rearming Britain belatedly. We were behind the Nazis, but he was actually investing in armaments and recognizing that if that failed, there would be a fail-safe. But we still think of him as a great appeaser. I'm now going to challenge the American political construct and say that Obama has been appeasing from the word go with China when he first of all allowed the island chains inside the South China Sea to be militarized. That's when America should have said, nope, get off those pieces of coral. Didn't. And ever since then, appeasement has been so common in politics that actually America doesn't even think of it as appeasement. Trump, for example, would have given Afghanistan to the Taliban. And Biden did the same. Both sides were prepared to appease an enemy that had been an enemy and cost blood and treasure, and yet they were happy to hand it away. If you go and look at the policy of Obama and you look at Biden, they've been appeasing Iran all the way through the process, despite the evidence of its failure. They fed a war in Yemen, and now they've literally fed this war in the Middle East by emboldening Iran. We've had appeasement with Ukraine. We've had appeasement with China. when it's infiltrated all across American systems, taking IP, just these running rings around America. And it's been one of acceptance, keep the peace and it'll all be okay. So I would say American politics is rife with appeasement. Trump's idea that he can close the war down in a day is just not viable, because you may be able to force the Ukrainians because you take their aid away, but the Russians are now in a full wartime mode with their whole economy dedicated to war, interlinked with the Chinese who support it. And I don't think Putin wants to stop. And even if you threaten to engage him with everything America has, he'll just turn to the Chinese and get support. So this is not something you can put the lid back on. Appeasement doesn't work. The only thing that does work is strength and deterrence. And as we've seen from Israel, we've had a really great reminder of, basically faced with the 7th of October, they followed a very logical course, which I've been able to predict well beforehand, because it's strategically appropriate. They've gone to the west and they've quelled Gaza. And, in the process of doing so, they lost a PR battle. They were made to look as if they were committing genocide. But the statistics are very different. Even if you take Hamas, statistics for the number killed at around 41,000, we can assume that 20,000 at least were Hezbollah fighters. The idea that the kill ratio, and I say this clinically, but recognizing it's a terrible process along the way, so don't think that I'm not without sensitivity to it, but a 1-to-1 kill ratio in an urban density environment and a 360-degree combat zone more complex than any we've ever seen is an incredible achievement by the IDF. And they're not given credit, but they should be. And what it means is that they're fully battle hardened. And as they go into Lebanon and now they're engaged in it, they are an incredibly capable operation. And, the whole intelligence penetration, whether it's the pagers or subsequently the walkie-talkies, or subsequently the way they've targeted using AI systems, basically what's left of the command structure, is a wake-up, as they've conducted probably the highest tempo air war campaign we have ever seen. And by tempo, I mean the speed at which you kill a target and you find the next one, and you kill a target and you find the next one. You miss the target, you re-engage it. It is like a completely different process. And what we're seeing is a reminder, having watched an impotency of Ukraine because they've been half equipped to NATO standards, of a NATO, capable, highly trained, and at the pinnacle of their operating capability, IDF, do some amazing, work in terms of clearing out their enemy to the north, which they had to do, because Hezbollah was the sword of Damocles which protected Iran's nuclear facilities, because it was always thought that if Israel went after them, Hezbollah's 150,000 rockets would saturate all the defenses and cause grievous harm. Now, I think that the sword of Damocles is moving more towards the dagger of Damocles. And the next step is definitely the engagement of Iran's nuclear facilities, whether it's Israel combined with America, or both, either or. That's what we're going to see next. And we will probably see essentially the rocketing of Israel by saturation attacks by Iran. And their calculus is really simple. Make no mistake about it. This is Iran waging war on Israel. Israel is, to America, like the forward outpost of an old empire. If you lose Israel, you lose the Middle East. Not only do you lose the Middle East, you lose all of the status. What's left of American hegemonic power is gone. The same with Ukraine. The fate of America depends on its outposts surviving as walls against the axis of autocracy's migration forwards. So this is an existential threat to America, as almost as much as it is to those countries that are on the front line. And I think what we're seeing is a reminder of what air power and modern technology really can do. And it brings a circle back to the creation of solutions to Ukraine, which I think in extremis could involve a NATO air exclusion zone, which I think we need to think about solutions, because we cannot afford to lose. I would epitomize where we are as the world is a forest fire, and it's really burning, and the rest of the world is going to catch fire. And the only way you can stop it is by creating huge fire breaks. And in this dynamic between an appeasing series of powers which are being preyed upon by predatory expansive systems, the only way you can create the fire break metaphorically is by getting ahead of the aggression curve and showing the intention politically and militarily to, when confronted with aggression, to act decisively. And that's what the IDF are doing. And they are proving to be the backbone of basically a weak Western system. And now we need to translate that lesson into how we help Ukraine solve the solution with Russia quickly before the Chinese join in.
Mhm. David, I wanted to take a small side tangent here. At the beginning of your answer, you're saying that you're really learning from history, but as we know, history is really written by the winners. So how do you try to really understand history from a couple different angles and try to account for that bias that might be inherent in how history is being written? And is that an important part of learning from that process?
Well, yes, you're right that the winner always writes about victory. But what I try and do is look at human systems according to my 5 stages of empire.
Mhm.
So I can understand that Germany, for example, was a series of Prussian states sitting under the Austrian Empire that created a customs union, specifically like the EU, to amalgamate them ultimately. That's exactly what happened. They also were at the beginning of their cycle as the youngest nascent country in Europe. And you had, old Spain, and you had old France, and you had Britain alongside, and then you had these Prussian states and the Austrian power sitting above them, such that by 1866 they went to war with Austria, employed new ways of logistical warfare using trains and needle guns, which are basically, instead of muzzle loading, their breech loading, and changed the face of warfare, beat the Austrian Empire, gained confidence, and then beat the French in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and became the premier land power as a result. And then they were forged in fire. They started to compete with France and Britain as an old empire in Africa. And that ultimately led to the curve of why World War I started, not because Archduke Ferdinand was essentially assassinated. That was the trigger. But they've been preparing for war since 1896 in the Spithead Review, where the Kaiser said to his grandmother, "I want a navy like that," which was a metaphor for the expansion of Germany seeking to be a global maritime power and take power from Britain. So they were on that curve of challenge, and Britain was on the curve of really decline on a relative basis from about 1860 as Germany and America rose. And the intersection of the two and the trigger for that hegemonic challenge was essentially the Kondratiev cycle, which peaked in 1920, but fermented war by 1914, 6 years before the peak. So when you look at that systematically, you don't have to rely on how people wrote. You can just look at the actual factual mechanisms that both systems underwent to trigger that conflict. And if you think of whatever we think of as, righteous empires and dark empires, the bottom line is all empires are adaptive and lateral on the way up, and they're more linear and contractive on the way down. And all systems seek for expansion. Democracy, is not a peaceful system. Democracies have expanded, like we saw with the neoconservatives wanting to take the world over. It's a simple reality that whether they're your system or someone else's, if they keep expanding, they'll want to expand and take territory and influence from other people around them. It's like a virus. All living systems expand. So we need to get that in our head. It's not a right or wrong, or it's just how systems operate. So it's the objective study of human dynamics, in effect.
Mhm. So, David, moving forward from that understanding, how do we apply that right now, in today's day and age? And, maybe we can kind of overlay that on our understanding of China and both the challenges that they're facing right now from, let's say, an economic standpoint with the stimulus package that they just released, the housing market collapse that they're facing, but also the buildup of their military might and how, the West needs to actually understand that for what it is, rather than, as you say, and I'm sure we'll get into, being possibly war blind to this possibility.
So let's just, stick each system on its empire curve. So America is the last of the Western Christian empires that started with the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then the Dutch, the French, then the British. Germany tried twice, and then America. And America went into the 5th stage of decline from 9/11 onwards. It lost its moral imperative. It went to wars which probably were optional rather than actually it had to do. And in the process, it bled itself, started printing money. And the process of printing money is essentially dangerous because it keeps non-competitive systems alive, because you decrease real returns and increase leverage, which allows people who are very linear to rise to the top doing the same things, because as they decrease their real productivity, leverage compensates. So the thing about money printing that accelerates decline is essentially the lack of adaptation and real productivity. And 20 years later, the Western world is riven with linear leaders like Biden, whether they're political or whether they are across the spectrum in the business leaders. One of Trump's advantages as a candidate is he's a rare lateral person. And that lateralness resonates with other lateral people who then, if they don't actually look at his version of lateral as dangerous, tick a box. And right now, the natural calling is to return to the expansive state of the American system, which was governed by lateral thought processes and leadership. So when Trump said, "Make me great," he created resonance, which was understandable. It was like the correction in a bear market, but he could never deliver with his other shortfalls. So, he wasn't really a strategic thinker. He was someone that did everything for short-term effect. And if you look at his policies now, it's basically insult anyone I can. There are no policies that actually he is leading with, which is fascinating, because nor does Harris. It's just like the election we had in the UK. It's an election of no policies. And the moment the Labour Party got in, they told everyone what their policy was, and they become immediately unpopular, because it's to take the money from the wealthy and redistribute it and take as much on the way as they can for themselves. Very Bolshevik, actually. And also with a sense of righteousness, that they are good people in the process. So hell, the road to hell is paved with good intentions is particularly applicable to mindsets like that. So our system is in decline. It's unadaptive. It's failed to respond. It has people that serve themselves and not their system. And most importantly, it's ejected the lateral thinking warning bells that would be warning, look at China, do something about it, because that just doesn't seem to feel and fit the railway tracks of linear thinking. On the other side, we're looking at China. Where is China? China started this particular empire cycle with the Boxer Revolution in 1902. It moved through its regional phase and went through a civil war, which coincided with the Second World War. I always think it's sort of interesting, whether it's the nationalists or the communists, they both would have been hierarchical. So their decision was versions of hierarchical leadership, not the difference between democracy and hierarchical leadership. And that attests to the nature of the scale and size of a Confucian China, which is how you order people of a scale of that population. Individuality is not what matters. It's basically obedience and connection to the various generational layers. And the Communist Party has got another version of that. It's hierarchical. And the thing that China then did was went to war with just about everyone who could and its neighbors. And for all those people that say China's peaceful, just look at the period post-Civil War to 75 when they got a bloody nose in Vietnam. They went to war with everyone they could. But then they hit a glass ceiling, and the glass ceiling was America beginning to win the Cold War, putting a ceiling over the top of Chinese expansion. And just when they were most expansive, they didn't have the technology and capabilities to get through the American glass ceiling of power. They tried once more in 1996, and they failed in the third Taiwan Straits crisis. So they decided they couldn't wait any longer, and they went to a have seduced the West to build our industrial base, use the industrial base to then subsequently create an arms race and then dominate the West, which is exactly the plan they've enacted. But their problem in the meantime, from the optimum expansion point of 1975 to essentially now, which is 2024 and 25, 50 years, they've lost their demographic energy. So they have one chance geostrategically to make their assault on the world. And after this, they don't have it. So time is not on their side. And they have manifested, weapons advances, asymmetric weapons of hegemonic challenge, like ship-killing ballistic missiles, which, were considered to be fanciful in 2018 and now been proven in the Red Sea with the Houthis, with very simple versions to have shut the Red Sea effectively, because we just don't have enough warships with anti-ballistic missile capabilities to keep them open, which is a warning sign, because the challenge that America has is that China has created an access denial, an area denial system, which goes out to the second island chain, which means they're going to be ejected very quickly, I think, in times of conflict. And the Chinese did something else. I've always argued the pandemic was not an accident. It came from a weapons laboratory, and its timing really did advantage China. And its strategic imperative was to force the West debt levels through the roof, so we couldn't engage in an arms race. And you think about Britain, for example, spent 400 billion, which is about 9 years of defense spending just going through the pandemic. And we are now defenseless because we don't spend money on defense. As a strategic, creative construct of weakening the West, it was brilliant. As so many other of their strategies have been, from IP extraction to the dominance of the steel industry, just by creating competitive scale, using their cheap power, which we don't have, and wiping out our fundamentals of how we can resist. Make no mistake, their plan is probably the most sophisticated challenge, which integrates, inveiglement and infiltration of the other system because of our open borders we've ever seen. And they're now ready to do something much more kinetic. And that story started, I think, in March 2020, when they emulated the Nazi 4-year plan, which is shifting in the case of China from a manufacturing export-driven economy to one that was much more internalized, not exporting in the same way, but it had a consumer demand gap. And that's the problem as they stockpile resources. And I've done a huge study in one of my sections on the site based on the scale of stockpiling the Chinese have of their resources. And put quite simply, you only do that if you're going to war. You only do the enactment of, legal processes where the big businesses now have their home and small, and everyone has to go into service training, and you can call people up quickly. Everything they've done is about the preparation for war. This isn't about the preparation for effective deterrence. Very, very different. This is a preparation for real war. And they're now coming to the stage with their financial difficulties that essentially they have reached the same point that Hitler did in 1939, go bust by 1940 or go to war. And my fear is, as we go through a failed Ukrainian war, i.e. failed because we in the West haven't given Ukraine what it needs to win, which we could have done and they could have done. And by win, I mean expel Russia from its 2014 borders. And we should have done, but Biden's fears and temerity stopped that, along with Sullivan's advice. And we're now looking at what's going on in the Middle East. And war is like a virus. It's a shift in mindset, and it triggers other predators into frenzies as they see weakness. And at the moment, unless you see decisive action quickly in Ukraine, the weakness in the Donbass, the perceived advances the Russians are making, the exhaustion of the Ukrainians is a very dangerous cocktail. And Biden refusing to use ATCMs to attack logistical chains inside Russia, which are then being used to attack Ukraine, there is a massive failure of intention. And this is all we have left is intention. We can't rematch the weapon solutions needed to counter Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonic weapons. That'll be 2 or 3 years away. All we can demonstrate is rock-hard intention like the Israelis and create doubt in Xi's mind. But again, I can't see that coming from Biden, and can't see that coming from Trump, funny enough, because he's not systematic enough. And maybe it might come from Harris because she is so weak, and therefore she will take military advice. That's the only thing I can think of in this particular pathway to a president that I can see hope in, is the very fact that Trump thought he knew better, and so did Biden disastrously, where there's no way she can actually think she knows better about the geostrategic picture because she has no experience of it, which means she may rely on advisors, and you can only hope that advisor isn't Jake Sullivan, because he's equally as responsible as Biden for the appeasement and mess we're in.
Mm-hmm. David, I want to go back and get a bit of an explanation for how you see really China's strength and or weakness right now. We have seen this stimulus pack come out from them. We've seen this housing market collapse. And, from the outside, you have to consider that China is being very strategic. So do you think that there is a possibility that they're actually underplaying the strength that they actually have in order to be underestimated? Or do you think that weakness is actually greater than we can actually analyze from the outside?
I think it's pretty major because, we've seen it before in other economies that focus on a wartime dynamic and fail to sustain themselves with exports. I think that the shift away from property is very strategic because property just sits there and doesn't do anything. Whereas if you can get that investment into your industry, then your economy grows and you become a more effective competitor, both in peace and conflict. So I can see the CCP wanting to change the focus of how predominant investment works in the country. I also think that what we've seen, our bellwether at best is that what's left of their public markets, like the A50. And the A50 has fallen significantly over the past years and was reaching a critical point where if it fell much lower, we all knew they were in super trouble. So it's actually the point where the central bank has acted to try and create a stimulus package. I think it's going to be short-lived. I think that ultimately what happened was that was a squeeze of Western hedge funds who were all effectively short of China. Once the squeeze is over, they'll turn around and it'll gone down again. I think what you're seeing is the end of the public face dynamic in the Chinese markets, because that was the chameleon's camouflage that made China look like it could be capitalist. But the CCP has no interest in it, as it has no interest in billionaires who've been successful openly because they just challenge their authority.
So, David, right now we're seeing the US enter a rate cutting cycle. We're also seeing China stimulate their economy. Obviously, the two biggest economies in the world needing to stimulate and kind of go back to this phase of easy monetary policy. What effect does that end up having on the rest of the world? And are we facing another, big round or another big cycle of inflation because of that?
Well, I think there's two elements to it. One is, it's a little bit like I give you an antibiotic and, the bug dies the first time, but some of it lingers. So I give the antibiotic again and it's less and less effective. And money printing is like that. Why is it like that? It's because, if I had 4% real production and I go down to 2%, I double the leverage, I'm back up to 4. Well, that works, and probably, 90 cents in the dollar combines to that growth. By the time I get to 40 times leverage, I'm giving $1 and I'm getting 1% difference, 1 cent difference. And that's why we're seeing the economy fail in America, because it cannot move forward by any more money printing. It's like completely knackered and blown out. And so, the next step is you try and cut rates. But I argue the timing made me laugh because it just exposed the Fed as no longer independent and highly political. They really, really did it, I think, for the election, because when there's a Middle Eastern conflict brewing and about to manifest that in all chances shuts down the Gulf and sends oils up to $150, cutting rates is the last thing you want to do. And that's exactly what these central banks like Britain and the US central bank did. They literally succumbed to political pressure. So they've and their dynamic is quite simple. They're no longer balanced between, the economy's growth and inflation. All they can do is keep the money press going, somehow keep the merry-go-round going, because the system is so bankrupt, metaphorically and really in real terms. And so, when you've got a debt burden which is more than your defense budget, the system's in trouble. And one of the biggest problems that we have is America's defense budget is not enough. It's been spending exactly the same, less in real terms, over the Biden term. And during that period, the arms race with China has gone through the roof. Its navy is degraded, its air force is degraded, its combat abilities are degraded, new weapons have come online, it hasn't adapted fast enough. America has not been spending the money it needs to literally keep pace with the changes that China are enacting. And, its industrial complex with 3 shipyards can build 1 submarine a year. And, it's having problems with its warship designs working. Everything is going wrong that could go wrong with the moribund linear defense industry in the States. And the only breath of fresh air is an organization like Anduril, now worth 14 billion, designed and put on the public line to look forward to see war coming and the DoD not being up to it, designing weapons that they knew would shorten the number of parts, building now Arsenal 1, which is massive, on 6th generation production lines that can make a missile one day and a gun the next day. These guys, it's not the DoD that's going to save the world. It's basically individuals like Anduril that have visions implemented that actually provide them when need comes along. And that was no different for Britain. The Spitfire didn't turn up because it was ordered, or the fighter command wasn't created because the air industry had a vision that the bomber doesn't always get through. On the contrary, it happened because public demanded fighter command came into being to protect them. De Havilland Mosquito, one of the most amazing fighters, was a private venture. And so these private ventures that have solved combat solutions were part of the Second World War. And, we need to realize that we need more Andurils, because the solution doesn't come from the government. It comes from industry, new production techniques to circumvent the whole gummed up system of military procurement in the West.
Mm-hmm. I think to underscore a point that you made earlier about China maybe preparing for, actual conflict. Do you think that the idea of how they've been stockpiling real goods like uranium, like gold, like copper over the last, especially 3 years, let's say, does that really set the stage for, a hotter and broader conflict than what we're currently seeing?
So let's just go back to a little period in history. Little known period of history is take the First World War. It's really interesting because it's little, really talked about.
Mhm.
And there were opening engagements of cruisers around the world that were quickly, dominated by the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy secured the oceans, in effect. They then tried to create barriers across the Channel and the North Sea because the commerce raiding became next via U-boats and some Q ships. And they failed on the whole because by 1917, there was a proper U-boat blockade that almost finished the war off. And during that period, there were neutral powers that essentially, like, for example, Denmark, Scandinavia, Norway, and Holland, and they were independent and neutral, and their war machine actually provided goods for Germany on the whole. But the irony is that Britain provided the coal or linguite for those four neutral countries. And we did it because otherwise we would have collapsed our energy industry. So essentially there we were fighting for, like tooth and nail on the front. We were supporting the neutrals' power supply system, and they were then making product for essentially Germany. A mad situation. But actually, it goes to the gas dynamic of Europe and Russia today, and the fact that from a globalized system, which the world was in 1914, to one where you have bifurcated sides, takes time without huge economic dislocation. But what really is interesting is we know about the Battle of Jutland, and that was, these dreadnoughts met and the Germans never came out again. And from that point onwards, and just afterwards, America joined the war. And that's when the neutrals stopped being provided, blockades became total, and the stranglehold on Germany became total. And the net result was they were strangled. So even though they finished the war on Armistice Day, they thought it was a pause before they could restart. And what forced them to the final table was the Royal Navy blockaded Germany for another 9 months. 450,000 Germans starved in that period because of the blockade. And finally, they were done. And there was a stab in the back theory, but it wasn't. They were just outfought and they were strangled. So when the Nazis started, their war plans, the first thing they understood was they had to have big enough stockpiles to enable them to go and take other people's territory, then make those stockpiles replace them and sustain their war industry. That's exactly the lesson China has learned, is that it would lose a global blockade because although it might be successful out to the second island chain or third, hopefully for them, the world's oceans are closed to them because their navy isn't able to occupy that space against the US Navy. So they're blockaded. And their resource space is the second island chain and Russia and the Asian continent. And they then have to feed their industry to build thousands of warships, which is their ultimate goal for global victory, in effect. And they do it using their own resources. So what you use is a stockpiling to bridge the gap between the time it takes you to acquire sustained resources as you conquer other lands. It is very much an aggressive posture.
David, we've spoken a lot about war already, and you certainly view, much of your understanding of the current world through this lens. So what would you say to people that give you the criticism that you're a warmonger? And what is the other part of understanding the world through that lens that is so important at this time?
So I do always chuckle slightly when people say he's a warmonger. Because what is a warmonger? A warmonger is someone that advocates war for gain and benefit of self and nation. I don't really think that fits my mold. What I've been trying to do is warn our society that sleepwalking into conflict by not confronting it actually was going to guarantee it took place. And what I've been trying to encourage is full spectrum deterrence. The priorities required to show strength to these predatory systems around us which have grown up to deter conflict. That is not a warmonger. That is someone actually banging a warning bell and providing the evidence that we need to wake up. And so where does that land? Well, I constructed this term, which we discussed before, and called the war blind. And so for every person that would call me a warmonger, I would say, well, are you war blind? And war blindness is one of the great sins. It's second only to being the predator that seeks to basically start the war, because war blindness is about appeasement. It's about turning one's back, about giving the opposition what they need, which fuels their aggression. And in the Western society, I think the reason why it has probably reached some of the highest levels I can find in history is threefold. There is a natural war blindness that came to Europe in 1914 because Pax Britannia had governed the peace, apart from a few smaller wars in Crimea, for example, since 1815 and Waterloo and Trafalgar, in effect. So hegemonic power meant peace was constructed, and the linear thinkers predominantly thought, well, if it's been peaceful for all this time, it will be peaceful going forwards, in effect, for 99 years. So that's one thing. I can sort of forgive them because, most of us believe that the sun will rise tomorrow because it did yesterday. And, it needs a more lateral thought process to say why and when could that stop. But let's just say that's one process. But we've also inflicted upon ourselves two very, very dangerous things. We've printed money, and the money printing, as we talked earlier, promotes linear leadership and thought. And the problem with that is as they gain power, all systems like to replicate themselves everywhere. So if they've been gained power and they think they're the successful thought process, they only tolerate lookalikes and some people like them. So they perpetuate more linear people underneath them, and they eject the lateral people they might see outside the railway tracks because it's inconvenient. So what we've seen in our society is an unprecedented coup and removal of lateral thinking people from influence. And they've been cast out and exiled, so much so that many have gone slightly mad, looking down rabbit holes, failing to apply their logic to work out which is real and which isn't. And to those, I would say, you have a purpose, and as entropy returns to the world, you will be valued again, because in an anti-entropic stable world, which is an artificial construct for money printing, why do you have to adapt? Because it's all under control. And the next thing that's really important is the US stock market has been propelled by asset expansion through money printing to highs. And the net effect is copious amounts of dopamine spreading through the American population that says if the stock market's high, everything has to be good. And that's another reason why with dopamine, there's no cortisol. There's no fear or examination of threat. And those three things, in effect, Pax America, the duration of the peace, this linearity of thought, and now the dopamine through markets have not just made 1 plus 1 equals 3, but made actually like 3 squared in the effect of collective denial and war blindness. And we need to be conscious of why many people are not and do not want to face the uncomfortable truth that we've walked into a blind alley and that alley is about to collapse on top of us.
So, David, I just want to try to understand, I guess, a little bit of the other sides of this coin. Again, trying to figure out what stimulus for the two biggest economies in the world means for the global economy going forward. What in turn would recession for the two biggest economies in the world mean for the economy going over this next, let's say, year to two?
So I think it's an interesting question, and it highlights if we live in the world of it's normal and it will be normal, let's have a normal conversation. Let's talk about the Fed and what they would do and lowering rates and are we in recession? Let's just keep talking about that like we have for 20 years. Great. But actually, what if we're in the period of a quantum change, that war has broken out, that we are in World War III, in which case all of it's completely secondary to the fact that we're going to have to create wartime economies with real productivity, which actually is a solution. One of the things that I think we've really missed a trick is the lesson of what America did in World War II. So war broke out in 1939, and Britain reached out to America and said, we need your help. Lend-Lease was created. American factories were at 50% capacity after 10 years after the Great Recession and Depression. And all they did was turn the taps on. They used money from the British Empire, which transferred out of British coffers into American coffers, funded a whole new manufacturing wave, which then created weapons that went back to Britain, at the same time created the manufacturing base that every one that the system created for Britain, it created two for America. It rearmed America at the price of the British Empire, shunting money from left to right. It was a win-win all over. And suddenly, America had real growth and stimulated dynamics of lateralization and productivity. So why haven't we done that with Ukraine? Well, some people will say, well, what are Ukraine going to lend lease with? Well, they have huge oil and gas fields off Crimea, enough to power the rest of Europe for decades. So they have that. They have a manufacturing base which, old Europe doesn't have. And they were the manufacturing base of the Soviet Union. So they have skills and components which would allow them to pay lease off when peace followed, assuming victory. So what we really should be doing, and Europe especially should have woken up to it, is we shouldn't be giving them aid. We should be lend leasing that aid. And we should basically be giving them our old equipment and use the money generated from the sale of the old equipment to build a manufacturing base to build ourselves new equipment. So, America gives them M1A1s, and then basically it funds more M1A2s if that's what you want, or modified versions with active protection systems like the Israelis have. But we have missed a trick. We should be thinking just as America did with Britain, to reinvigorate our arms, to prepare to face off and create deterrence, and also create a solution where essentially Ukraine is protected, but there's a financial arrangement that benefits the side that's providing protection.
Mm-hmm. So, David, is this really the end as well of globalization? And, it seems to me that ends up being highly inflationary as well, not only war and, switching from, let's call it a production-based economy to a war-based economy.
So the evidence is that globalization peaked in 2018. And actually, we've been coming off ever since. And we're now fully bifurcated into an axis of autocracy and, the Western system of democracy with people in the middle who are undecided as to who they are. Mm-hmm. So essentially, we're already there. And part of the inflationary cycle that comes with the C wave of the contractive cycle, which is roughly from 2020 through to 2030, is about underlying, inflationary dynamics. And I think the reason we don't see it is because if you looked at inflation on the same measures as they were in 1917 to the 75 peak, we would have much higher inflation. Our numbers in the West have been manipulated again to justify printing money because it's inconvenient to do so. But if you look at the inflation experienced in food in the UK, it's just staggering how much food costs. I don't know how many people survive. I really don't. And yet that wouldn't appear in numbers which the financial markets consider meaningful. So what we've really got is stealth inflation, and it's a product, as you quite rightly say, of a bifurcation taking place in deglobalization, and it has lots of momentum behind it already.
Mm-hmm. I think another part of this, let's say this warfare idea that we have to really address properly or consider properly is the idea of economic warfare. Not only active war, but I think economic warfare is a big component of a conflict going forward. So how do you try to take that into account as well?
So, there's no empire I've ever found that economically manifested power that didn't manifest military power that didn't then use it. So the two equate. China's become an economic powerhouse and it's transferred its economic powerhouse to a military powerhouse through its industrialization power, and now wants to take over everything it can see. That's the pattern. And conversely, the West has deindustrialized, and deindustrialization has meant that we haven't armed ourselves. It's the exact opposite. In fact, you can correlate the rise of a system to industrialization and the decline of a system to deindustrialization. Mm-hmm. And there's a story of the West and the East right in front of us. Now, what's relevant, though, is how far back China's economic war against the West took place. It started in 2000. It was a process of seduction to invest in manufacturing, the IP extraction from anything they invested in. They conducted like a full-on economic war, which designed to create economic superiority from which they'd have manufacturing superiority, from which they'd have military superiority. And we didn't show up to the game because all we were interested in was our P&Ls. And, there are lots of people. I noticed that, BlackRock, who busy said we should think about whether or not you invest in China. Great, mate. The BlackRock have invested just and been part of the transference of wealth and knowledge to China. It's a bit late to say. I'm glad they're saying it, but it's a little bit like, we know we've been caught. Let's go first and say everyone else is wrong. It's a fundamental sense of Western greed. And I laughed when I saw Larry Fink come out with that. It's, because the truth is, people, like Ray Dalio, who funded by the Chinese or did heavily into China. And those people have a huge responsibility for the undermining of their children's future. And I stood up in 2017 in front of a very large trade congress with the British government and the Chinese, and posed a question, basically not to the Chinese, but everyone there, saying, you do understand that by trading and relating to China, you are undermining your children's future by strengthening their economic hand, which will translate to their military adventurism. I almost got thrown out at that stage, and that was in 2017. So this isn't something which I've taken to recently. It's something I've been warning about since I formulated Breaking the Code of History. And I was appalled at the greed of the West, and the liberal West especially, that just thought, well, we'll use cheap manufacturing. Whoops, then they create factories and they automate them. I mean, it's just like, what have we done? If you just traveled the stars and you looked at, the West, we deserve our own demise. We've been greedy, stupid, hubristic, and we need to wake up, because this is last chance saloon.
So what chance do you think there is, David, for actually waking up and avoiding any part of this that we've spoken about, or are we doomed to repeat this over and over and over as a species, not just at this point in history?
Well, when I started Breaking the Code of History, it wasn't just an advertising, look what I found, how clever I am. It was actually as a warning, a self-help book for the planet, to be aware of these cycles and the ones we were following, and that World War III would start in 2022 onwards, written 20 years beforehand. So I tried to create a warning through education. I hoped I might have had an impact. I then started Global Forecaster in 2019. And although our reach has gone across the world and we have, all sorts of people who follow work, they are predominantly lateral people. The linear people don't want to know about this other worldview. So my conclusion is, just as in many ways linearity took Britain into war against Germany, and they hung on to power in the early years, it was only when the Norway campaign was a disaster was they forced to step down and Churchill stepped up, and linearity was replaced by lateral thinking. Zelensky hasn't been replaced because he is a lateral thinker. That's how he survived so long. So, I'm afraid we've now got to the stage where nothing will change the momentum of our blind system. And the only thing that's going to change is we're going to hit the brick wall very badly. And it's just how many pieces are left to pick up to carry on the fight. In World War XIV, in 1914, it wasn't until the late end of 1917 when the Allies really got forward and started to create mechanisms whereby they could advance and reverse really what were 3 years of war. In the Second World War, it wasn't until 1942 that we saw any progress. So we are going to see some very dark times where literally we are on the back foot and, pummeled. And that means the linear thought driven leaders will be dislodged. And then, the hospital pass to the lateral people coming to take and fix it will essentially take place. And you just hope there's enough left for them to formulate a fight back. But I'm afraid I can only see a desperate outcome with the course we've taken.
So, David, as individuals, if we're trying to be strategic thinkers, what steps do you think we need to be taking in order to, let's say, best survive or thrive through a time like this?
So I'm assuming that anyone that's listening to us right now is pretty lateral anyway. And the linear ones have turned off and said, oh, he's a warmonger.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's assume each one of you is a lateral thinking person, will have had thoughts along these lines, even though they may not be as formulated. And you'll feel slightly unappreciated by society and therefore everyone for their own lifeboat. But there's a simple reality. This struggle is so big. The Chinese aren't going to stop at the Asian basin. They're coming for all of us. Our values, our individuality, our children, our gene lines of lateral democratic thought are at risk to be replaced by hierarchy and control. So there is nowhere to go. What we need to do is, first of all, understand what is happening to us. And in that regard, one perspective is the one I provide. And I suggest that although it might be difficult, go to my site, explore it, and also sign up for Marinations, because it'll explain what is really happening to us and in a predictive way that'll give you internal knowledge. It's not a newspaper where you read a few facts. It explains to you the constructs that govern the key themes and the problems we have and how to solve them. And there is the first place. As a lateral person, we all have a role to play in the lateral fight back, which is to help adapt our society. So that means we need to be verbal. We need to speak about what's happening with passion. Be logical. Don't be illogical about it, because that puts everyone off. Have enough understanding to be logical to explain to the war blind the dangers of war blindness. At the same time, understanding where you are financially and making sure that you're not overstretched, because in wartime, as you translate to a wartime economy, all peacetime revenue streams cease, which is a big concern. And there are whole strategies which are on my site about what assets you follow and what you do with it, which have been incredibly well of how to, how to operate, as the namesake of our podcast is. And I think there's huge upside that goes with that. But the point is also to believe, and this is the piece of hope which I'm going to give us, is I believe that the world is a quantum mechanical world. When I studied physics, it was an esoteric theory of interest. We have quantum engineering, quantum computers, quantum sensors, quantum communication. So believe me, the quantum realm is real, as they would say on Ant-Man, but it is real. And part of that process is that consciousness interacts with the universe. So if someone said, in the long run, who do you think's going to be the most powerful, vital system? Is it going to be hierarchy with lots of human batteries suborned to one person at the top? Or is it the model of democracy of individual growth and evolution? I'm going to argue it's human evolution. Because on the quantum world, the more conscious people become in the way they interact, the more they can use the quantum reality to change reality. And in warfare, I think there are lots of examples of people unconsciously are doing that. But if we can become aware of the role of lateralization, individuality, and the use of that quantum thought process, then individuals have a huge force multiplier, ones that make a big difference in combat against a homogeneous system that's less adaptive. And much as a struggle may be a hell of a struggle, ultimately, I would put my money on our outcome. It's just a question of how badly we lose, how many people to get there that were needlessly lost. But I think that is ultimately our destiny. But so I think the West will prevail, but we are going to have such a bloody nose in our evolution back to lateralism, one that was unnecessary, and we need to learn how to do it voluntarily. And so there are also tools on the site that if you have a business and you're worried it's not adaptive enough, then you can use the tools of how to lateralize, which are highlighted on the site. If you have a military formation, one of the things that's very clear is all Ukrainian formations that are linear lasted very few days. The ones that had lateral leadership adapted and survived. So you can create lateralization before entering combat, which is what special forces organizations do. They always emphasize lateralization, which is combat adaptability. So there are lots of things that can be done. And for those of you that are linear listening and, going, oh my God, David, who is he? This is all a conversation. I urge you to be at the forefront of the linear group that starts to look at this reality, because there's a cascade of change that starts with the lateral group and then cascades through to more lateral people. And then finally it hits the linear people and the whole lot switches and changes. And all human social changes go through this evolution. So I urge linear people to recognize it isn't as if lateral people are better or linear people are better. Our real skills are lateral strategic thinking applied with linear application. So we have a symbiosis that's critical. Stop fighting each other for being different and recognize that lateral linear combinations are game changing. And understanding that we can't all do things. I know I can't run under 100 meters under 10 seconds. Never going to happen. Never would have happened. Never going to happen. But somehow we think that we can all do the things that each others do in our heads. But thinking is more differential than any physical trait. So we need to understand that humans are not all the same. Yes, we understand IQs, but we don't understand the processing within IQs, which are lateral and linear. So I embrace people to be less discerning and separate and actually embrace what we're designed to do and work towards that. And if we do that, we have all sorts of potentiality, but we need to brace for a really good, sadly, drubbing. and a test of willpower before we get there, as the Ukrainians have suffered.
Well, David, I want to thank you for your work in trying to educate and shed some light on these ways of understanding the world, understanding history, understanding conflict, and I really appreciate having you, I guess, reiterate some of those lessons for us. For those that want to learn more from David, that's all available at David Murrin, 2 R's, murrin.co.uk. And of course, excellent Twitter follow as well at Global Forecaster.
There's one thing I really want to add, because it was back in sort of 9/11 and after that I created the 5-stage model of empire as a social construct, which replicated through the fractals of organizations, tribes, countries, and empires. But as a physicist, there was this understanding of prime drivers, and I never really sort of had a concept of what drove us to self-organize like that. So it was only in 2019 when I thought, well, okay, what could this construct be? And my argument is as follows, and I think it's really important that it's at the end here, because it's really key. The universe is full of entropy. Entropy is order going to disorder. And, it creates a destruction of order, which is living things, in effect, over time, which is why we age and die. Now, how do you survive in an entropic universe? Well, I created this word called human anti-entropy. We create entropy. We create order around us, which lets us. So I look at our homes. Outside there's, chaos in nature, and here there's order in our homes. A little old grand lady, who's tired, will always sweep her porch and keep her kitchen clean. That's anti-entropy at work. And, human systems do it everywhere, all the way from top to bottom. It's almost like a hidden form of energy. So when we have, for example, terrible natural disasters as Florida's had, the entropy of the system has been applied, and human entropy will start tidying up the backyard, clear away the debris, and then go back to order. That's what we do. And the coherence of that human anti-entropy is the coherence that drives us to self-organization in empires. At the peak of an empire, it is the most anti-entropic it can be. And when it starts its decline, it is less anti-entropic. By the time it reaches the declining phase, entropy is taking over, and it's old, decaying, and falling apart. And that's why it encourages challenge and ascension from another system that's now more anti-entropic. So what we've got here is a system of rise and fall of anti-entropy, which creates advance in our knowledge. So if we had an empire and it could sit in an isolation, the decline phase would probably last quite a long time, because there was nothing to sweep it aside. America will keep printing money for further and keep putting band-aids on. But what happens is another empire rises up, and that's literally challenges the old system and displaces it to maximize the human growth curve of anti-entropy, because you stop delivering new anti-entropy and the system fails. So it's got to keep moving up the curve. And for example, human resource from power is we use human batteries and slavery for a long time. Then the Industrial Revolution came about and we used steam and coal. And then suddenly, because Britain was the most industrialized country in the world, we got rid of slaves very early on because we didn't need that form of power anymore. Then we replaced coal with oil and then nuclear power, and all of it's more dense and calorific per unit volume. So that's our evolution. Energy fuels the size and scale of our empires. So they get bigger with time as you develop it. Now, the thing that's really interesting is that these contractive cycles are entropic pulses. Now, it's a whole conversation of where they come from. But what they are doing is they are every 112 years and every 56 years. The 56 one just never seems to really change very much how the hegemonic balance is. It sort of portends to the future balance. But every 112 years or so, man, this pulse is so great. The challenger rises up and basically tries to sweep aside the old hegemon. And you can go back to the French with the Spanish. You can go back to Britain with France and the Napoleonic Wars. Germany tried with Britain, and the byproduct was America slipped through and Russia slipped through as the next powers. And then basically we've got the Chinese challenge to the West. So I say this, until we are aware of that cycle collectively, we are going to keep having wars, because those wars lateralize our societies and promote accelerated growth. So we're using war to evolve. And until we find a substitute, because we knowingly understand how we're evolving, we are going to keep fighting the wars, and the peace is just part of the cycle, and we're never escaping the paradigm.
Interesting. I'll have to go back and and listen to that again, but I'm going to go practice some anti-entropic practice right now and clean up the rest of my office. David, I really appreciate the time, and always a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Thank you for the privilege of being on your show, Tom. It's always a pleasure.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.